Everybody go. All right. So thank you. So we are starting our actual lessons. I know, thank you, George. The first week I was out, George came in and did the introduction for me, so thank you for doing that. And we are going to start our actual lessons today, starting with lesson 1. What we are doing in this series is we are actually following, skip a couple of, that's actually not where I wanted to be. I wanted to be on that slide. So we are following a series that was developed by Dr. David Klingler. The name of it is Moses, the Last Sermon of Moses. Dr. David Klingler is a professor at Dallas Seminary. He happens to be my son's advisor. So that's how we came to know him and became familiar with some of his works. And last year when we were working on, or 2 years ago, I can't remember, when we were working on the prophets, I started realizing that all the prophets are referring back to what? Deuteronomy, Moses. Moses is the foundation. He's the key. But if we really want to understand the line of prophets, I really need to dig in and start understanding Deuteronomy better. So that's what kind of set me on the journey of trying to study and understand Deuteronomy a little bit better. And I found this study and shared it with the Brynies and some other people, and looked like, hey, this would be a fun study to go through. And I think you're actually doing a study with some of your ladies that you're working with too. So if you want to follow along with this series, you are welcome to do this online. It is at teachmethebible.com. It's a little bit hard to find, but if you search, just type in the search bar here. If you go in, he has the way his structure is set up. You can go and find Bible studies, or it's not intuitive. It is a separate standalone study. So you may have to just type in last sermon series, last sermon of Moses or something like that, and you can find it. And he has some short videos that answer some of the discussion questions and things like that. So if you want to watch some of those, we're going to be doing some of our own things, some of his, kind of a combination, but that's kind of the basis of what we're doing. All right. Now what we're going to be doing each week, this is a little bit different study. It's not a what you would typically think of as a normal Bible study where we take it and go verse by verse, but chapter by chapter and things like that. What we're going to do is we're trying to see how does the book of Deuteronomy inform the rest of Scripture, and how does it apply to us today? And it's not just what does it say, but what are the connections, the whole Bible connections from this book. Somebody once said, what is the most important book of the Bible? Somebody once said that Deuteronomy is the most important book because it informs so much of what happens elsewhere in the Old Testament and even the New Testament. So that's what we're trying to look at today and make those connections. We're going to start with a passage, and it'll be what we call an instruction passage. We'll read the passage and see what Deuteronomy tells us as an instruction, and then we'll look at an application passage. The application is not the application to you or to us today. It is an application to how did this apply, how did Israel or how did they apply it, or how did they use that instruction?
Or not.
Or not. And that's part of it. What was the result? Was this a good application, or they didn't apply it well, they obeyed, they didn't obey? And what was the result? Then we'll have some discussion questions around those things. So for example, here it says, he actually gives us an example. The law instructs Israel to do this. They are doing this, something different, and that's bad. And what's the result of that? And then finally, we'll have a selection of discussion and application questions. What I'm going to try to do, in addition, is have just a contextual overview at the very beginning. Now, the first session is chapters 1 through 4. So we're going to spend a few minutes going through this overview at the very beginning, just to provide the context of what's going on in chapters 1 through 4. And then we'll dive into some of his questions. Does that make sense? So because we're looking at a few extra chapters, this is one of the longest lessons, actually, as far as the number of chapters that are involved. But the reason we're doing 4 chapters at once is these first 4 chapters are the first sermon of Moses. The book of Deuteronomy is made up of 4 separate sermons or messages. You can think of it as 4 messages that comprise one sermon, or 4 separate sermons, however you want to approach it. But there's 4 distinctive narratives where Moses is actually speaking to the people, and they're divided by a brief narration where the narrator breaks into the action and kind of fills in a little bit of the details for you, and then Moses starts speaking again. Most of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking. It's a direct quote from Moses. So the first 4 chapters are that first set of that first message, and then chapter 4 ends with a brief narration. Then chapter 5 starts back Moses speaking, and then we'll take each of those sections and break those down accordingly as we go through this session. Now I apologize over here. I like this map because it shows the whole the whole context, but I couldn't find all the supporting documentation that went along with this map. So ignore all the 1, 2, 3, 4s. Don't try to line those up over here. Those don't align. I should have gone in and blocked out the numbers. It's just a picture that I found.
I like it.
I like the picture, but I didn't have the notes. Whoever put so I just put my own notes over here. This is an outline of the first 4 chapters. It's largely focusing on this map. What Moses is doing, actually, I'm going to start before we get into the looking at the outline. I want to start with just the first 4 verses. The first 4 verses are a narration that kind of sets the tone for what we're doing. This is the introduction, the historical setting. It says in verse 1, "These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah across from Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab." Now, all those names, we really don't know where they are. There's some speculation about where those are located. The only one we really know for sure of this list is the Arabah. The Arabah is a valley that extends from here all the way up. It's kind of into the Jordan River Valley. It's a big wilderness, a valley. If you look at a relief map of the area, it is just a big dip in the area. So this is the Arabah Valley that goes up through that area. So, so these are the words that he spoke in the Arabah opposite Suf. Well, we know from other contexts that they're actually up in this area right on the northern edge of the Dead Sea. So this is where they're situated, where the story begins, where Moses is speaking. It says, "It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea." So Horeb is Mount Sinai. He says it's 11 days' journey from here to Kadesh Barnea. What happened at Kadesh Barnea?
They chose not to go in.
They chose not to go in. That was their first attempt, or their first opportunity, I should say, to possess the promised land. He says 11 days' journey, but now listen to the next verse. "Now it happened in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had commanded him to give to them." So now they're up here in the 40th year, up here at this location. This is almost a slap. I don't want to say it's a slap to the Israelites, but it's comedy, but it's also a dig to them. It says, this is 11 days journey, but here we are in the 40th year up here getting ready to take this promised land that it should have taken us 11 days journey to get there and take it, but you refused. So it's kind of a dig there. It says, it took you 40 years to get here. And then in verse 4 it says, "After he had struck down Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in the Ashtaroth and Edrei." And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing these words exactly right, but these are the kings up in this area. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get through here. But this is the introduction. From this point forward, it is all Moses speaking. So verse 5, verse 5 says, "Across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying," and then quote, Yahweh our God spoke to us, and then it's a quote for 4 chapters. Just one long speech. One other thing I want to point out is up here in verse 1, it says, these are the words. I think you talked about this in the introduction, didn't you? So this book was originally called, I can't remember the Hebrew name for it, because somebody has their notes from last time.
It's these are the words.
But it means, these translates, these are the words. That's what the Jews or the Israelites would have called this book, is these are the words. When it was translated to Greek, you applied the name Deuteronomy, which means second law. It could refer to the second giving of the law, or and we talked about there's different seconds in here. There's second chances, second opportunities to take the land. There are a lot of seconds we're talking about. But it's the second of the law is what Deuteronomy actually means, literally. Hi, Lauren. All right, so let's just go through our outline very quickly, and just want to set the stage so you understand what's happening in these first 4 chapters. So any questions so far about what we're doing? All right. Oh, okay. I didn't know what it was. I dropped. Thank you.
Just get them all back.
Yeah. All right, so chapter 1. So Deuteronomy chapter 1 brings us, I'm just going to read some notes here, brings us into the setting of the wilderness where Moses addresses the Israelites, recounting their journey from Mount Sinai to the significant events that shaped them. This chapter gives us a glimpse into the promises, challenges, and decisions faced by the Israelites and how they reacted to God's commands. So again, we start with a setting, verses 1 through 4 or 5, whichever way you want to break or split that. So beginning in verse 5, verses 5 through 8, this says, verses 5 through 7, I'm going to split this in a couple of bullets here. The beginnings at Horeb, or the beginnings at Mount Sinai. Now at this point, Moses is remembering or recollecting what happened, in their early history, because he wants them to remember who they are, how they got to where they are at this point. So he's reflecting back on their early history. He said, so we started in Horeb. God commands the Israelites to take possession of the land that he has promised to their ancestors. And he's emphasizing God's faithfulness. God is going to give you the land. And then we all know what happens here, point B, 19 through 46. They arrive at arrive at Kadesh Barnea. They come to Moses and say, hey, we think it'd be a good idea to send some spies in, kind of check things out before we go into the land. And Moses says, I think it's a good idea. So they sent the spies in, and what did they do? What was the report they brought back?
2 of them said it was great.
Yeah.
The food's great. They got great lunch and dinner. They got great, they got a great buffet, but the people there are really tall and really big, and there's no way we're going to be able to beat them or defeat them. So they decided they did not want to go in and possess the land. God was angry with them, and he sentenced them to what?
Camping.
Camping for 40 years. But not only that, what was the ultimate
Everybody's
sentence?
going to die.
Everybody's going to die. That generation, nobody in that generation, save Joshua and Caleb, would be the ones who would be able to go in and possess the land with the new generation that followed. So, and then we jump from there in chapter 2. Chapter 2 recounts part of Israelites' 40-year journey into the wilderness, guided by God's commands. Moses narrates how God instructed them to steer clear of the conflict with certain nations, emphasizing God's sovereignty over both Israel and other nations. So we get a fresh start here in chapter 2. We're starting to head north, and he recounts their journey from Kadesh Barnea to Mount Seir in verses 1 through 8. Israel traveled from the Red Sea toward the hill country, and then instructed them to turn northward. God told the Israelites to avoid the Edomites. said, they're not gonna like you. There's some tension there, just avoid them. You can get food from them, purchase from them, but don't provoke them at all. Go around the Edomites. So here we are over here, they've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Now we're starting to head northward, so we come around over here and pass through Edom, and then we continue on through, let's see, I lost track, where's verses 4 through 8? Make it up, okay. Okay, so the next one is, for Moab, it's the next section. Past Moab and Ammon, and Ammon, okay, that's where I am. So similarly, God advises Israelites not to harass the Moabites or engage in battle with them. So we continue on past the Moabites. Actually, there's an interesting point here in verse, I can't remember which verse it is, where they arrived at the Zered, the creek or river Zered. It's been 38 years at that
13,
point.
14,
Yeah, so when they crossed here, it had been 38 years
yeah.
since they left. So that was a marker for them. And then God instructs them to go around Moab. Same type of thing, you can buy from them, things like that, but don't engage in battle with them, because God's protected their land as well. God has given them their land as possession, so you can't have any of their land. Don't engage with them.
Just think about those people. I mean, there's millions of people coming, I mean, what would we think if all of a sudden, people just traversing through our town or our city? Or,
We'd let them come through.
we wouldn't like them very much either.
Yeah, Bob would be provoked.
It would be kind of like locusts coming through.
Yeah. Now Scott would set up the shop on the side, hey, we'll engage in business with you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you want to buy? What do you want to buy?
Yeah,
Raise the price of gas.
there you go.
That's gouging.
We don't do that. All right, so pass by Moab, and they're not going to engage in battle with the Ammonites. And then in verses 24 to 25, God encourages Israelites, telling them to prepare for battle against Sihon. And I like the transition here. When you get to verse 24, I believe it is, it says, "Arise, set out and pass through the valley of Arnon. Look, I have given you Sihon the Amorite." It's like, behold, now you're starting to see some of the land that you're going to possess. So they arrive up here, and God tells them to prepare for battle, because he's going to give them this land that they're now looking at, they're now approaching. In verses 26 to 30, we describe the battle. Israel requests safe passage from the king, and so they can. So they approach him with good intention, saying, "Hey, you know what? We want to just pass through. We're trying to get over here. We want to cross the Jordan River. This is our land. We don't want to bother you. Just let us go by, just like we did with the Edomites, the Moabites, and so forth, and we'll just be on our way." But God intervened. What did God do? He hardened his heart. He stiffened his neck, whatever you want to say, so that he would resist and provoke battle. And they engaged in battle with the king of Sihon, and he was utterly destroyed. They left no cities and left no survivors.
It is actually their land though, so, because
Yeah, it is part of
in the
old-
first chapter, when he starts off, he says, he recounts, okay, this is our land, and it stretches to the Euphrates.
Mhm.
It doesn't include Moab, because that's Lot's descendants, and it doesn't
Yeah.
include Edom.
So all the way up to
Above
the
Moab.
Euphrates, right.
Yeah.
They never actually possessed the full land that was promised to
Yeah.
them. So, but you're right, I mean, this was their land that they were entitled to
Yeah.
from the promise. But their initial approach to Sihon was, we're just gonna pass through.
Yeah.
Just let us go over here to this area, and we'll leave you guys alone. But God hardened his heart, and so then they would engage in battle. Yep. So you're right, actually, and the land that was promised to them is a lot more than just what we identify as Canaan. It, like you said, it goes all the way up to the Euphrates, to Lebanon, and quite a ways east as well. Pardon?
I'm just looking, my map goes all the way up, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we have the battle of Sihon. So then we enter into chapter 3. There's another king in the area, the king of Bashan. You see Bashan up here. You see these two battles up here. Of the little, I assume that's what little crowns are, their placement there is for. So we have victory over Og, the king of Bashan. Very similar story. You know, they captured all the cities, not a single city stood, and no survivors. So they utterly defeated these two kings up in this area. Then in verses 12 to 22, we start distributing the land. So the land that is over on this side was distributed between Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So Moses went ahead and distributed that land to those children, or those tribes. And and then he gives them a caution. He says, now, you've got your land over here on the east side of the Jordan, and we're gonna keep going all the way over. Don't get complacent and feel like this isn't part of your battle as well. You're gonna fight with us, with all of the tribes, and we're gonna possess this land, and then you can go back and get comfortable and settle in your land. But yeah, you've got your land, don't think that excludes you from participating in future battles that come. So Moses gives them that warning or that caution. And then, let's see. Okay, so he distributes the land, and at the very end of chapter 3, Moses makes one final plea. Moses was excluded from traveling into the promised land, or from entering the promised land. He makes one final plea to God, says, God, is it possible that you could let me go in and see the promised land, or go into the land? And God says, nope, you're not going. It's only Joshua and Caleb from that generation, but you go up to the top of this mountain, and I'll allow you to see the land. So that was God's concession to Moses. So one of the things that we want to see in these 3 chapters, what Moses is trying to convey to, well, let me just ask you this. Why do you think Moses is recapping or recounting all this information to Israel?
Well, you got a new generation. They didn't live it. Everybody's dying.
Yeah,
So
okay, so that's good.
they
Like,
lived it.
yeah, there's a new generation that don't necessarily know the stories, haven't lived it, but what about the story is he trying to convey? Why is the story important?
To learn from it,
What?
to learn from it.
Okay, but what do they learn?
They learn to know God
Okay, what about God?
is mighty.
He's like their provider, their protector, their.
Right, yeah, he's provided for them all along. He is the one who fights for them. He's the one who said, go in and take the land when they were camped at Kadesh Barnea, said, go in and take the land, I will fight for you. And then they didn't, they got scared and they rebelled, and God got mad, and then what did they do? They said, okay, we'll go fight. So they went and fought, but this time they didn't have God's blessing. God wasn't with them, and they got utterly destroyed because God wasn't with them. So he's teaching them that when God is with you, when you're following God, you're obeying God, he will fight your battles. He will win for you. He is mighty. He's a warrior. He is your God.
I thought it was really interesting too that Moses, on several occasions, as he's talking, that he's not able to go into the promised land, he tells them it's because of you.
Yeah,
It's your fault I'm not going into the promised land. It's real, I thought that was really weird, because I had never noticed that before, but yeah, he lets them know, because of you, I am not entering into the promised land.
yeah, that is an interesting observation.
They also, if you go back into chapter 1, they grumbled against God and said, Yahweh hates us. They impugned God's character.
Yeah.
Didn't just say, we're not going because we're scared. If they had approached God, we're scared, I think God would have come back and say, follow me and you will see. They didn't do that, they impugned his character.
Yeah. So another thing that is interesting about Deuteronomy, there is a shift from the previous verses in the books in the Pentateuch. And again, this is on my notes, I'm not sure George covered this in the introduction, but when God talks about his love for Israel, the way he expresses it in Deuteronomy, that's new. He never expressed his love for his people in the previous verses. The word that's used for love is used to talk about I love food, or I love my wife, or I love this. But it was never used of God or Yahweh expressing his love to his people. In Deuteronomy, there's a shift. It's used throughout Deuteronomy where God is now expressing his love effusively for his people. I love you guys. I am your God. I will not let you down. That's what Moses is trying to communicate to Israel at this point.
They were the bearers too, so that the world would know. Blessing now will bless you, and cursing now will curse you, so that the world will know I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, part of this cycle of failure, repentance, restoration, and then sin, it becomes their entire story.
Yeah.
So that we can demonstrate to the world.
Okay, then moving on to chapter 4, there's kind of a break here. The tone or the story shifts a little bit. Up to chapter 4, chapters 1 through 3 are more of just a reflection, a looking back on where we are. This is what we've done, and now we start into some exhortations, if you will, in chapter 4. So chapter 4, Moses reminds the Israelites of the importance of following God's laws and commands. Through vivid recounting of the past, he underscores the dangers of idolatry and the dire consequences of turning away from God. This chapter emphasizes the uniqueness of God's relationship with Israel and their responsibility as his chosen people. So verses 1 through 4, Moses instructs Israel to obey God's decrees and statutes. And he recalls the incident of, and I cannot say this, Baal Peor. Is that how you say it?
Sure.
Okay, so if there's no, I didn't know if there was somebody said, no, this is how you pronounce it. So if there's no,
No, that's
wanna-
what we're gonna
you wanna-
say it from now on.
yeah.
You said it.
That's it. Just didn't want to kick over any elephants and purple. Sorry. Okay, so the incident at Baal Peor, where those who followed Baal were destroyed. So do you guys remember this story? It's documented in Numbers, but do you remember the story of Baal Peor? What happened? So if you go to Numbers, we won't read the whole thing, but Numbers 25, verses 1 through 9, Moses is referring to this incident in Moab to illustrate Israel's history, where at Baal Peor, the Israelites entered into spiritual and physical adultery with the Moabite women and were put to death by the word or died in a plague. So God's punishment, or lost the other word, but yeah, punishment, he sent a plague. 24,000 people died as a punishment for their behavior, for the adultery at Baal Peor. And God is saying, Moses is telling them to remember what happened here. God is just. Obey God's commands. You're not going to escape his commands. So, obey him and be faithful to God. Verses 5 through 8, he moves on and says, Israel, he reminded them to follow God's statutes so that because they will serve as what? An example to the other nations. Like this is what you're referring to. They will demonstrate wisdom and understanding. This obedience sets them apart from other nations. They're the only nation. At one point he says, what other nation has a God who meets with them in fire and gives them their commands? What other nation has a God who walks with them in the desert, provides food for them? Your God does this for you. So obey him and demonstrate to the other nations the character of your God. And then in verses 9 through 14, he goes back and reflects on the giving of the 10 Commandments. He reminds them that they saw, this is what I was referring to here, they saw no form, they didn't hear his voice. Excuse me. But yet they received the 10 Commandments, emphasizing again, avoiding the idol worship, avoiding the idols. Excuse me. 15 through verses 15 through 31, he's emphasizing idol worship, or the prohibition against idolatry. He cautions them against crafting any image, any idol, emphasizing that they saw, again, God spoke to them in the bush, and they received his word. Don't craft an idol to replace this God. But of course, what did they do when Moses was on Mount Sinai? So it is also a reflection of them, remind them of their previous sins. It said, don't do that, don't craft these idols. But in verse 25 through 31, what is he predicting? Moses predicts that if Israel becomes corrupt and does make idols, what will happen? They will be scattered among the nations, and they will actually become slaves again to the nations. And they will, not only are they dispersed, but they are scattered. I hadn't really thought about that before. We think about the dispersion. It's one thing for people to be dispersed, maybe as a group, where you can retain some of your culture, some of your identity and things like that. But they were not dispersed as a group. They were scattered, where they didn't have each other to hold on to or depend on. They lost their identity as a nation in this dispersion.
It's sheep without a shepherd, almost.
Yes, exactly. So he predicted that they will be dispersed. And then we wrap up in verses 32 through 40. I'm going to go and read through this. This is his reminder to...
While you're looking, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
When I was studying the last couple of weeks, so they'll be scattered and they'll remain few in number among the nations. So Israelites, Jewish people today are what, maybe 10 million worldwide, whereas the descendants of Ishmael are about 1 billion.
Which, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says they will remain a small number. And at first, I read one commentary about this, about a small number meant insignificant. I don't think we can say that the small number meant they were insignificant. I don't agree with that. They were small in number, but God's people are always significant.
And it's also a miracle that they survived, though. So
Yes.
it's there is a remnant that they survived, which any ethnic group that small would have assimilated and been gone.
Right.
Or just been killed off, and obviously Hitler and the Nazis tried.
He tried that, right? Yeah, and so that again is the miracle of the being scattered. It's like I said, it's one thing if you disperse a group as a whole,
Yeah.
but they were completely scattered across multiple nations, and yet God still preserved them as his people.
Christ couldn't come again until the Jewish people said, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord," till they came to faith in him. So if Hitler and others had been successful in eradicating the Jews, Christ couldn't come again.
Of course, that didn't happen, wouldn't happen, but so in verses 32 through 40, actually I'm not going to read this passage because we're actually running out of time, but Moses reiterates the unparalleled deeds of Israel. He emphasizes there's no other God who's interacted with humans like the Lord has with Israel. Israel is urged to acknowledge the Lord and obey his commands for their own prosperity. So another thing that struck me as we're going through these passages is, why do you obey? It's for your prosperity. It's not, yes, it's for God's glory, but he's telling them to obey because you will prosper, you will have influence among the nations.
Well, and not just that, is with Moses demonstrating that you will be punished or
Yes,
you'll get,
there are consequences.
there are consequences
Yes.
to sin against me, even if you believe.
Mhm. Yeah, it's true. So chapter 4 wraps up, there's a few verses at the very end, where we break back out into the narrator, starting with verse 41. The narrator jumps back in and says, okay, after this, Moses established the cities of refuge, and then there's an epilogue, starting with verses, the last 4 or 5 verses, where the narrator just kind of recaps what we talked about in the previous four chapters. So that is chapters 1 through 4, just from a context perspective. So what we want to do, and we are not going to have time to go through each one of these. George and Scott and I have talked about, as we look at the lessons that Klingler has put together, he's put a series of questions in there, and I've put them on your notes here. And you can look at those. We're just gonna pick, in other words, we're not gonna have time to go through all of these discussions and all of these questions on here. But you can take this home and work through this some on your own if you want to do that at home. But we're going to go through a couple of them, whatever time we have, and see if we can, see what we can accomplish. So the way this is set up, I'm sorry, I've got coughing. The way this is set up is we have a instruction passage and we have an application passage. Question 1 is actually an example that Klingler gives us to illustrate how we're going to approach this. Could I get somebody to look up Deuteronomy 20:16 through 18? And somebody look up Joshua 1 through 27.
So I got the Deuteronomy.
You got Deuteronomy, okay, fire away.
However,
Okay, hold on. While he's reading, listen and think, what is the instruction? What is God telling you to do? Go ahead.
you must not let anything living survive among the cities of these people the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance. You must completely destroy them, the Hittite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you.
Okay, so what did you hear here? What's the,
Destroy, don't let anybody survive.
let's see, how is this not? Oh, there we go. Yeah, instructions, these are instructions to Israel for conquering the land. The nations living in the land were to be completely destroyed. Do not leave anything that breathes. So they, and why, he tells them why. So they would not teach Israel their abominations and cause Israel to sin. It's all about obedience, all about staying true and faithful to God. Don't let these people influence you, just get rid of them. Nations outside the promised land could be offered peace, but they would become servants of Israel. So if you were far out of the promised area, then we could establish a peace with you, but you have to be far outside of the promised area. So what happens in Joshua 1 through 27?
I have it. Do you want the whole thing read?
Can you start, and we'll start when we get,
Yeah.
well, actually, in the interest of time, I think we pretty much know the story. The Gibeonites came in and they deceived Israel. They came to him and said, you know what, we'll pretend to be from far away. Yeah. So they came and they offered peace to Israel. And Joshua made a covenant with them. Joshua made the covenant with them, and swore an oath to the Gibeonites, and then he found out that he had been deceived. They were angry, but there's nothing they could do because they swore an oath to them. And what was the lesson they learned here? They didn't ask God before they made the oath. So what is the result of this? So what do we learn? We have an instruction. Here's the action. What do we learn from this?
Seek God.
Seek God. Yeah.
They didn't.
And they didn't seek God. Yep.
Wait on God.
Wait on God. They acted impetuously. Yes. be discerning, all of those things are good lessons.
I was gonna say vet them.
Yeah.
You need to vet your.
Trust but verify, something
Yeah,
like that.
verify your enemies, man.
Right. So they learned this lesson the hard way. They didn't go to God and say, God, what is your plan? Should we make this covenant with the Gibeonites? They should have destroyed them, and they didn't. So that was a failure, one of the first failures that we see from, or not one of the first, but it was one of the failures that we see. Okay, so now, let's see, I think, yeah, let's do this one. We may not get to the other two, but let's look at, I guess I'm gonna look at Deuteronomy 1:17, 10:17, and 24:17. So who's got 1:17?
I do.
Okay, 10:17.
I'll get it.
Okay, Wendy's got 10:17, and then 24:17. A lot of 17s here.
I'll do that one.
Okay, 24:17. Okay, then over here, Matthew Matthew 7, 1 and 2.
I got it.
Okay, Romans 2, 1 through 11,
I've got Romans.
and James 2, 1 through 16. All right, so Deuteronomy 1:17. What do we see here? Let's read that and see what we observe.
You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. In the case that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it.
Okay, so judges should show no partiality in judgment. The judgment belongs to God. We recall, we didn't read this in detail, but one of the things that Moses did, that he reminded them of in chapters 1 through 4, is that he established leaders to judge the cases on his behalf. And he's, telling them, they should show no partiality in judgment. The judgment actually belongs to God. Okay, so 10:17.
For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who does not show partiality nor take a bribe.
So God does not show partiality to anybody. There's no respecter of persons. He takes no bribes. You can't bribe God into doing what you want him to do. So, all right? 24:17.
You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge.
Okay? Don't pervert justice that is due to strangers, orphans, widows, and so forth. So don't pervert what God intended. All right, so let's see how this has played out. Let's go to Matthew 7.
Judge not that ye not be judged, for with what judgment ye judge, you shall be judged, and with the measure ye might, it shall be measured to you again.
Okay, so this is interesting. We come over here, we see that all these verses about how we judge, but then we get to Matthew 7, he says, judge not. What's going on there?
Well, it's almost like judgment belongs to God, so you have to kind of connect those two, that at the end of the day, God is the official judge.
Well, they're judging impartial. I mean, they're favorites, and
Yep.
they're not judging correctly.
Okay, so if we, who is he speaking to in Matthew 7? He's actually speaking to the Pharisees. If you back up a few verses, he's speaking to the Pharisees. What are the Pharisees doing? How are they judging?
By their own standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, by their own standards. They're not following God's standards. They are showing partiality. They're setting up their own rules and things like that. So he's telling the Pharisees, do not judge. Yeah, they're not following the
They're not
rules.
doing it right.
Right. Okay, so Romans 2.
Therefore, any of you who are judges, any one of you who judges is without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, do the same things. We know that God's judgment on those who do such things is based on truth. Do you really think, any of you who judges, who do such things, that you will escape God's judgment? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness, restraint, and patience, not recognizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? But because of your hardness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath, When God's righteous judgment is revealed, he will repay each one according to his works. Eternal life to those who persist in doing good, seek glory, honor, and immortality, but wrath and indignation for those who are self-seeking and disobey the truth, but are obeying unrighteousness. Affliction and distress for every human being who does evil, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does what is good, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. There is no favoritism with God.
Okay, so it was a little bit longer passage than I remember it being, but here, the Jews are, Romans chapter 2 condemns the Jews who judge the Gentile for their lawlessness while they themselves are doing the same things. It's hypocritical. They're saying, you're doing these things and we're judging you for it, but they are doing the same things while they are judging. There is but one standard to be applied, whether to the Jew or the Gentile. God is impartial in his judgments. God is the standard, not our own interpretation, our own laws, or things like that. And then, let's see, who's got James 2?
I found it again.
Okay, you've got, you go ahead, let's,
Okay.
I know it's a longer passage, but we'll go through it.
My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you, and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Should I go to 16?
That's good. So a couple of things I want to point out here is, if you keep the whole law but fail at one point, you're guilty of the whole law. The people he's addressing in this passage, he's condemning because one, they're showing no mercy, and they're showing partiality. They're favoring certain people over other people. So they are sinning by showing partiality, especially against the poor, and they're judging with evil motives. They're not showing mercy to those to whom mercy should be given. So how, pardon?
So I want to add one thing. I think it goes back to the two major things that Jesus always says: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind.
Yep.
Love your neighbor as yourself. So when you are loving God, then you can love your neighbor and not show partiality. And you're not favoring people because you're loving them as you would love God. And God can't take a bribe because he owns everything.
That's a good point. Gosh, we're running out of time here. I wanted to do the first discussion question. There's a lot in this first discussion question. But I think we're just not gonna have time to look at this. In the first discussion question, it says, in Deuteronomy 1:17, Moses recounts how he instructed the judges to show no partiality in judgment. And we go back and we look at Leviticus 19:16-19, and then some other passages of Deuteronomy. One of the things that I did in this, as I was preparing for this, I'll just kind of show this to you. I went through each of these passages and I highlighted it in green, the positive, do this, do this. What is he telling us to do? And then in red, what is he saying? Stop doing this, don't do this. I highlighted those things in red. And then in the yellow, I highlighted those things that reveal things to me about God's character. What is he trying to teach us about God's character in these passages? And how do those things relate to each other? And so if we look at God's character, which is he's wanting us to learn about who God is, we see things like the judgment belongs to God. God is the judge. God is the ultimate arbiter. He is Yahweh. Yahweh is your God. He does not show partiality. He does not take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and widow. He shows love for the sojourners. He provides the towns and the land to the people. There's a lot of things that we see about God's character as we read through this. These rules are there, given for a purpose. When Klingler is talking about this passage, he says, what is the most often quoted verse in the Bible?
Judge not, be judged.
Yeah, if you'd asked me, I would have said probably John 3:16.
Yeah.
But he actually found, research and everything says no. The actual most quoted verse that most people know is judge not, because they like to throw that back at you. It says, you can't judge me. The Bible says judge not. But what is that verse talking about? We now know he's talking to the Pharisees. But if we go back to Deuteronomy and look at the whole passage, judgment is valid. We are to judge, but judge without partiality. Follow God's principles and his standards and honor God. Show mercy and things like that. So that's the takeaway there from judge not. I want to go to a section here. I'm going to skip a couple of questions. I'm going to wrap up with this. One of the things that we want to do is make some connections from Deuteronomy to the New Testament. Deuteronomy is quoted frequently in the New Testament. So from this passage, chapters 1 through 4, there's a couple of passages that are quoted here. In Deuteronomy 4:22 through 24, it says, for I will die in this land, I shall not cross the Jordan, but you shall cross and take possession of this land. This is Moses speaking to Israel. So, because I'm not going to go with you, keep yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of Yahweh. Remember God, which the covenant which he kept for you, and lest you make for yourselves a graven image and form anything against which Yahweh your God has commanded you. For God, your God, is a consuming fire, a jealous God. This is his warning to Israel. Guys, I'm not going to be able to go in this land with you and help and oversee and coach you and all this sort of stuff. Be careful out there. God is a consuming fire. He's a jealous God. Over here in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, again, we're receiving a kingdom. We're taking possession of a kingdom. The same language. Let us show gratitude by which we may offer God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. For, why? Our God is a consuming fire. It's the same reference. We're about to possess this kingdom. In Deuteronomy, we're possessing this land. Be careful. Obey, because God is a consuming fire. And then lastly, in Deuteronomy 4:33-35, has any people heard the voice of God speaking in the midst of the fire? This is what we're referring to earlier, where Moses is saying, who else has had this kind of an experience with a God? Who has heard him speaking in the midst of a fire and heard it and lived? Nobody else can say they've heard God speak to them and lived in their presence. Or has God tried to go take for himself a nation from within another nation with trials? So he moved them out of Egypt. He took them out of another nation with signs and wonders, and with war, with mighty hand, and with an outstretched arm, and with great terrors, as Yahweh your God did for you in Egypt. To you is shown that you might know that Yahweh, he is God, there is no other besides him. Mark, Jesus comes back and says, one of the scribes came and heard them arguing. He said, what commandment is the foremost of all? The foremost is the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and I think you were referring to, somebody was referring to this earlier. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That is a reference also to Deuteronomy 6. The second is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And down here it says, the scribe response is right. He is one, and there is no one else besides him. So even Jesus is referring back and acknowledging the tie back to Deuteronomy. They know this passage. He is one. The Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So I'm sorry, I kind of wrapped up very quickly because we're running out of time. But each week, what we hope to do is show the ties from Deuteronomy into the New Testament and show how Jesus is referring to these and what these mean. What I would encourage you to do is, and I will email out a PDF copy of this if you didn't get one, but continue going through and looking at those questions, those discussion questions, and respond to those yourselves. I think you get a lot more out of the study if you dig in and do a little bit of it yourselves. This week is probably the most challenging because we're covering so much at one time. Going forward, we're going to take 1 or 2 chapters, so it'll be a little bit less. But anyway, I hope that was meaningful to you. Hope it's. I think this will be a fun study as we go forward. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
Salad supper, ladies.